Pillars of Eternity 2 Deadfire is to me the quintessential Obsidian game, not only for its content or its genre, but for its circumstances, development, reception, and context within Obsidian Entertainment as a company. It is a game that speaks to me very directly as a leftist, as a systems designer, as a content creator, and heck, as a hobbyist sailor. I've liked sailing for a long time. Like most ludicrously spoiled upper-class children, I had the opportunity to learn to sail as a kid. I loved sailing for a couple of reasons. First, it was satisfying to command and maintain a small sailboat. It's akin to owning your first car, except you're 10 years old and you can only drive around the parking lot because you're physically incapable of both holding down the pedal and seeing the road ahead, on account of being the size of a 10-year-old, that is. Second, it was a break from people. When you're a kid, being alone on a patch of lake grants you a sense of privacy that you can't otherwise replicate at that age. Your room is still under your parents' roof after all, and all they have to do is turn a doorknob to revoke that privacy. Privacy gives way to the best, most productive kind of introspection, a kind that would end up informing how I play RPGs for years to come. Sorry for the whiplash there. My first proper RPG experience was Fallout New Vegas. I watched a cool friend play it one time in middle school, and I wanted to be cool too, so I bought an Xbox 360 and the game. Well, they were bought for me. Ludicrously spoiled child. CRPGs, by their nature, are solo experiences compared to their TTRPG counterparts. Their particular strength, in my mind, is their ability to speak to the player directly, rather than address and juggle a party of rabble-rousing players all with their own wacky characters, temperaments, and expectations. That focus on a single player opens a lot of doors, the most valuable of which is, in my mind, the opportunity to let the player reflect on themselves and grow. The intent of most role-playing games is to let your player assume any role. That doesn't particularly interest me. Escapism never appealed to me, most likely because my sheer wealth of privilege and frictionless childhood never really convinced me I ought to escape to anywhere. Rather, what propelled me through these RPGs was a drive for self-improvement. RPGs have the potential to be a sandbox in which to practice morality. They can be a guiding tool. Empathy is how we set the stakes, by writing personable characters who otherwise inhabit a worthless digital world. In this way, there emerges a fine line between making a game that maximizes player choice and making a game that shirks morality in order to favor player choice, and in doing so, usually permits or even promotes toxic behavior as comparable to appropriate behavior. Like most of Obsidian's games, the first Pillars of Eternity is a game that I struggle to criticize, not because it's perfect, but because its flaws are so calculated. The development of its systems was so closely tied to being a nostalgia trip that many of its flaws are obligatory, like the resting mechanics or the initially lackluster player stronghold. Criticizing the resting system is moot, because I can go to the Obsidian Entertainment forums and have a developer say to me, yes, this mechanic is bad, here's how we'd have done it if we weren't on a deadline and under the gaze of 73,000 backers. I am of the impression that the first Pillars crossed that aforementioned line, that it let your character be cruel and aggressive without really conveying why you ought not to be so cruel and aggressive if you were to step away from the game and act as your character. Not only that, but I initially saw its overarching plot and its climactic twist to be a lesser version of the Elder Scrolls' Dwemer race. See the Numidium Red Mountain and basically everything Michael Kirkbride had written for the Elder Scrolls III Morrowind. Essentially, the gods are fabricated and are actually just transcended mortals. Standard fare, right? I held on to that sentiment for a while, until I became a leftist. Did somebody ask for more whiplash? Fallout New Vegas calls the path in which you fight for your own New Vegas the wildcard path, so my only real interaction with the word anarchism was with the game's Followers of the Apocalypse, which the Fallout Wiki describes as being an anarchical faction. It wasn't until last year that I became politically aware, or that I ever brought capitalism or statehood under any scrutiny at all. I'm sad to say that my personal ideological revolution came independently of any video game experience, although that is a problem I'd like to fix myself by developing the kinds of games that might facilitate such personal ideological revolutions. Anyway, over the course of about a month, I harvested an absurd amount of class consciousness and started looking at video games through that lens. The obvious first case study was Fallout New Vegas. It became clear that the independent path was the most humane choice to make. After all, if anarchism is the correct answer, then every faction in the game is out of the running. Mr. House is a tyrannical autocrat, which is a redundant statement, by the way. The NCR let capitalism eat democracy again, And Caesar's Legion, aside from being a band of imperialistic rapist slavers, bad praxis all around really, they are the post-apocalypse equivalent of an accelerationist movement. The next game to look at was Pillars of Eternity. It was then that I realized what made the twist so radically different from that proposed by the Elder Scrolls and Kirkbride. The gods are a ruling class, conjuring a system that pits a theistic middle class against any animancer who might accidentally undermine the gods' power. The modified wheel of mortal reincarnation, or Barith's wheel as it's called, is a rather unambiguous metaphor for capitalism, a bit of profit shaved off the top of every soul that lets the gods grow yet stronger and exert yet more leverage on the common folk who generate it. Suddenly, this system is a lot more different than Morrowind's understanding of transcendence and gradients. All it took was some Marx and Kropotkin, and suddenly Pillars of Eternity becomes a solid proving ground for testing my perspective on how power ought to be distributed. My shift to radical leftism also brought me to sympathize with those who practice religion. Before the shift, I was the kind of atheist who thought less of others for having any kind of faith. I have now come to realize that 1. One's belief system and its respective governing body are to be separated and judged separately. 2. These governing bodies wield power over and actively propagandize their respective worshippers, so dismantling power structures that oppress is more important and constructive than chastising any one worshipper. And 3. Some folks benefit from their faith without harming anyone else, and belittling them for their faith helps no one. Those 3 points are tricky to balance, but they're all important, and I ended up finding that balance speaking to a particular character named Jyoti in, you guessed it, Pillars of Eternity 2, Deadfire. Deadfire is a sweet, sweet amalgam of many of the elements of artistry that helped me define myself. The seafaring, a process that is relatively stress-free and encourages unbridled exploration, harkens to that core desire to be independent and in charge of one's own destiny, to have the total freedom of choice that we both yearn for in reality and are gifted by many CRPGs of Deadfire's ilk. To travel aimlessly into the fog and find nothing is, to me, as rewarding as stumbling across a dungeon, not only because composer Justin Bell's soundtrack is utterly enchanting, but also because it grants me the downtime to think about my character and the effects they're having on the planet of Eora, and what my character's actions say about me as a player. But most importantly, I wanted to talk about 2 things. I'll start with the easy one. Deadfire's 4 factions are wildly compelling. It's easy to write off the Valiant Trading Company as mercantilist colonialist scum, and in fact you should, but it's easy to forget that the Watcher, the protagonist, speaks not to the Council, but to the middlemen, those who, like the common folks of Eora under the gods, are just doing the best they can in a system rigged against them. The same impression can be felt among the tribal Juana, who are by far the most sympathetic of the factions. They are the setting's natives, the land is explicitly theirs, and despite the presence of the grand city of Neketaka, the Juana people mostly keep to themselves on other islands. Their trappings are their monarchical system, which on the surface seems like the only case of autocracy, and their belief in a caste system, which deems Juana citizens at birth to be of a working, middle, or ruling class based on their deeds in their previous life. The game does not reveal whether this caste system actually functions, or whether it is a ruse to establish and indoctrinate a working class. It is, after all, entirely possible that the god Barith, or Tangaloa, or whomever, validates this caste system, or that the system is total bupkis to begin with. And either way, this is another case of the ruling class maintaining itself through subjugation. Look next to the Rauatai, who are unabashedly imperialist but invade out of desperation. They've been ravaged by storms and natural disasters in which Eora are under the dominion of the god Andra, who favors the Juana. Once again, this struggle is kickstarted by the gods to focus folks squabbling on each other rather than at the gods. The Principi, a group of loosely organized pirates, are the only real anarchists, but they're more anarchist in the chaotic sense than the horizontal distribution of leadership sense. Still, any revolutionary force that has the ability to undermine any of the classical power structures is valuable to some extent. The factions are all wrong, and for a while that frustrated me. I thought, well, it's not a very satisfying choice to pick between bad and also bad. The same feeling rang true through New Vegas as well, but at least the NCR was a proper democracy, or at least it was trying to be one. It wasn't until the end of Deadfire that I realized that the whole point was to despise any concentration of power. Speaking of which, the god Aethys, who is quite literally the embodiment of concentrated power. Deadfire is an excellent Act 2 to a 3-act series. Act 1 is the build-up to the plot's major twist. The gods are a construct and exploit common folk for their own gain. Act 2 is the process of questioning that construct and understanding who it hurts and how. The end of Act 2 is a declaration of revolution. Aothis is going to destroy the Wheel, the system that strips souls of their power for the benefit of the gods. Hot dang, Aothis. If it's not obvious by now, I had no qualms in letting Aothis rip the Wheel to shreds. If the gods had mangled it beyond repair, then the only way to end the cycle of exploitation is with a big green giant and a couple of well-placed punches into some ancient divine technology. The moment I learned of Aothis' plan to free humanity, I felt comfortable. All the frustration I had felt with each faction was alleviated when I realized I agreed with the ideals of the game's antagonist. Granted, to achieve the goal, Aothis was stripping away the souls of thousands of innocent people, but nothing in the game will allow you to stop him, and so by the time you reach him, he's there at the wheel, and you may as well sit back and let him rip it apart anyway. Comfort is an odd feeling to feel in an Obsidian RPG because the studio thrives on giving players morally gray choices without obvious solutions. Of course, the more literature you've read, the more black and white these choices become, but never do you get to feel comfortable doing the right thing by letting the antagonist do the thing he wanted to do all along. Aothis' writing is spectacular, and it's yet bolstered further by the Beast of Winter DLC, and supposedly even more so in the 5.0 update. After about a year of waiting in communist and anarchist and generally leftist literature, it was Aothis and a saint named Widewin who made me feel like the time I spent radicalizing myself and practicing empathy was meaningful, valuable. It's easy to feel helpless, just in general, you know? Being critical of any dominant power structure is an uphill battle. Heck, any kind of growth is an uphill battle. Being a good person is an uphill battle. It's hard to feel that work pay off when you're abused and exploited by peers and strangers. It's hard to practice activism when it comes at the risk of losing financial stability or reputation. So I suppose, after all, Deadfire taught me to appreciate escapism in my own twisted, revolutionary way. In Deadfire, I could engage in my own kind of praxis, albeit a supernatural kind with fireballs and imps and the festering body of the god Weil. Deadfire plopped me on a boat on my own patch of lake and asked me what I believed was right. I sat and pondered and finally answered, with about 120 hours of gameplay. And at the end of those 120 hours, I part from Aothis and Deadfire, being told this: I have great hope for you, but always remember that your future is for you to decide. Use your freedom well. In May 2019, Obsidian Entertainment released its final update for Pillars of Eternity 2 Deadfire. The update adds story content and some extra challenges for veteran players, but most importantly, it marks the end of a chapter of Obsidian's 15-year history as an independent studio. In late 2018, Microsoft announced it had acquired Obsidian. The Outer Worlds will be the next game released by Obsidian, inspired by the world of Fallout and led by Fallout's original creators, Tim Kaine and Leonard Boyarsky. The game takes place in the distant future and in distant space, where megacorporations have begun colonizing and run what are essentially galactic mining towns. The game will see your character choosing to side with or revolt against these corporations to decide the fate of the colonies you visit. The Outer Worlds will certainly say something about capitalism upon its release in late October, but the developers, including Kaine and Boyarsky, have refused to confirm that themselves in interviews and in front of the media. In this particular political climate, it's easy to see why. Anti-capitalism and leftism in general is a hard sell nowadays, no pun intended, and Obsidian is in no position to turn off a chunk of its fan base by trying to market capital P political games. Ultimately, it's more about Obsidian's stubborn adherence to player choice that makes their games look stellar, but their PR interactions look like acts of cowardly retreat. Any leftist worth their salt knows that all art is political and this can't be escaped. But Obsidian isn't beholden to leftists, they're beholden to everyone. Well, technically they're beholden to Microsoft, but Microsoft, a megacorporation of its own, likely has the same idea of what good PR looks like. It's a shame that Obsidian has succumbed to the whims of late-stage capitalism, but even internally, the studio has witnessed its own share of mistreatment at the hands of its upper management. Co-founder Chris Avellone left the company essentially because he was being emotionally abused by upper management after pointing out a case of nepotism, And current design director Josh Sawyer gave a post-mortem on Deadfire, mourning the development of the game's ship combat system, which Sawyer intended to scrap due to its complexity and need for valuable resources, but the owners demanded remain. Undemocratic, vertical leadership will always be a problem for Obsidian, internally and externally, and so the acquisition by Microsoft simply adds an extra layer of that unjust leadership atop it. The developers have acknowledged the irony, sure, but if anything, it makes the whole experience that much more unsettling. Obsidian as a studio, in its games, in its practices, and in its final predicament as an acquired company, is steeped in leftist rhetoric. Deadfire is the closest these developers have come to saying anything about the current political climate except for perhaps the original Fallout, which actively condemns greed, consumerism, and nationalism through the game's iconic setting and tone. I don't know if this video ought to be a lecture to Obsidian, or simply a rumination on its circumstance, but either way, it makes me want to play some Deadfire. Can we end it here? Thanks, friend.